Is that okay without?
Yes, fine.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. On behalf of the library trustees, I want to thank our sponsors, Dean and Hamilton Realtors and the Cook Estate, and Bruce Sinclair, owner of A Taste for Wine and Spirits. Our speaker today is Daniel Everett, who will talk about his controversial book, Language, the Cultural Tool, which was published last year. In the New York Times book review of the Cultural Tool, reviewer John McWhorter says, quote, Everett's book is a study of theory compatible with Darwinism, anthropology, philosophy, and psychology. And that's what really turned the committee on to this particular book. Dr. Everett began his career many years ago as a missionary in the Americas. Today, he is an ardent librettist, musician, linguist, and educator, among many other things. He has taught classes and chaired linguistics departments around the world and is currently Dean of Arts and Sciences at Bentley University. Stay with us after Dr. Everett's talk for wine and cheese. His book is available here for purchase and signing. So if you will please welcome with me now Dan Everett. We'll let him take the stage.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a privilege to be here with you. I haven't been to Cohasset yet. I'm originally from San Diego, so every time I think of the ocean, I think I need to go west. If it says, you know, beach or anything like that, I think it must be west. My direction is still reversed. This book, Language, the Cultural Tool, is the outgrowth of a great deal of work, and both a lot of technical work in the field of linguistics, but at the same time it's written for a general audience. For a long time, for many, many years, we have been, the most popular view of language has been that it is an innate capacity of human beings, that it is in our genome, that there's something called universal grammar. And Noam Chomsky, who I've known for the last 28 years, and my first ever PhD student in the US is full professor in Chomsky's department. So I've had a lot of connection with Chomsky. It used to be that, I don't know if it's still up, but in Carta Encyclopedia, if you looked up Chomsky, I wrote the entry on him. The first part of the book is how not only is there no real evidence, in spite of almost 60 years of research trying to find it, for neurological specialization or psychological specialization for language, but that more importantly there is a much simpler view that language is developed or evolves to solve a communication problem. We're a very interesting species in that we're the only species that cannot exist without communicating with one another. Many other species communicate. But one of the things that's interesting, an thought experiment, and this was suggested by Sarah Hardy, who's the author of a great book called Mothers and Others, about the development of children. And she uses the analogy of, I'm flying out to San Diego tomorrow, and I suspect that there will not be, given normal passengers, there won't be a big fist fight or anything like that on the airplane, that when we land, in spite of being in an aluminum tube for about 5 hours, we'll be ready to get off the plane, but there won't be major disagreements. On the other hand, if we filled all those seats with chimpanzees and tried to fly it out 5 hours, probably there wouldn't be much left of the plane or of them by the time they got there. And one of the reasons, even though that we're so closely related to chimpanzees in evolutionary terms, one of the greatest differences between us is the desire to cooperate and communicate. Humans somehow develop this capacity as part of who we are, and cooperation and communication sets us a problem that we need to solve. From the data, we can tell that we first solved this problem in Africa sometime between 50 and 100,000 or even 200,000 years ago. And that the first languages were formed before human beings left Africa, before our species left, and that as we channeled out across the world, we took these original language structures and solutions with us, and we added to them and changed them according to the local environment. In English, we have a very simple verb structure. It's pathetically simple. There are 5 forms for a verb: sing, sang, sung, singing, sings. It always amazes me when it's difficult for people to learn that, because there's only 5 forms. If you learn Spanish, you'll learn about 40 to 50 forms. If you learn Piraha, or many of the languages of the Americas, you'll learn verbs that are far more complex. So every Piraha verb has 16 possible suffixes. That means there are 65,000 plus possible forms for every Piraha verb. And none of those things that are included in the verb are things that are familiar to us. So when you talk about an action in Piraha, you have to give a suffix use a suffix that tells you whether the action took place in a level field, or whether it went up, or whether it went down, whether it's seen as a whole or seen as parts. And one of the most interesting things about the Piraha language, and many languages around the world have such characteristics, is you have to give evidence on every verb for the assertion that you're making. So if I say John left, there's a suffix that will tell me whether I saw him leave, or whether I heard from somebody that he left, or whether I'm just inferring that he left. And these are vital parts of Piraha culture. The second half of the book then explores all the ways that that language, or not all the ways, it explores some of the ways that language is shaped by culture. What is culture? Culture is a problematic notion in anthropology. It used to be said, we used to think we could say that Japanese is culture type A, let's say, and America is culture type B. We realize that culture is an abstraction, just like language is. What is English, for example? That's a huge abstraction. Is English what we speak here? Does it include what they speak in London? Does it include what's spoken in London, Madras, India, and Sydney, Australia? All of those are different forms of language, and yet we can understand them, and we place this abstract label and say, somewhat truthfully, somewhat falsely, that they're all English. And it's the same thing. I speak Portuguese in Brazil. I remember watching television in Europe, and I was enjoying flipping through the channels because they had all of the, so many different languages. And I knew which each language was, and I got to one channel and I said, what language is that? And then I realized that's Portuguese. That's the language I speak. But it was European Portuguese, and it took me a couple of minutes to make the sound adjustments because the difference between European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese are much greater than the differences between American English and British English, for example. So culture is a way of living. Culture is a way of getting meaning out of the world around us. When I walk with the Pirahas in the jungle, and I see a branch moving, to me, that simply is a branch moving. But to the Piraha, they will know immediately whether the wind caused the branch to move, like an obvious thing that many of us don't tend to notice. If that's the only branch moving, it's probably not the wind. But if there are multiple branches moving at the same time, maybe it's the wind. And these are tall trees, so it's not always that easy to tell, but they will know whether it's a snake or a monkey or a bird. They'll know exactly what kind it is. And before I can even have recognized it, if they want to, and it's not too high, they will have shot it out of the tree with a bow and arrow. And so this insider perspective, this brings culture. This brings values, it brings ways of looking at the world. Cultures can be broken down in my view of culture that I talk about in the book, but it's not original with me. It actually started back in the 40s with a number of anthropologists. Fell out of favor, but I think it's the way to look at culture, and that is in terms of values. So if let's say that we look at the French and we say they like good food, they like to be fit, they like to work hard. And we go to, let's say, Houston, and we say they like good food, they like to work hard, and they like to be fit. But the average person in Houston doesn't look like the average person in Paris. And so let's think they have those same values, I assume. This is not a scientific study, just illustration. They have those same values, but if your first and most important value is being fit, and your second value is working hard, and your third value is good food, you're going to look different than somebody whose first value is good food, and their second value is hard work, and their third value is being fit. So it's not just the values, it's the ranking between the values. And a lot of what the second half of the book does is to talk about how those values in specific societies are linked to structures of the language and how they can help us understand the structure. So after all, we are, when we're learning our culture, we learn, when do we start learning culture, by the way? Well, we seem to start learning it in the womb. You know, we learn from sounds what our mothers react to and the way she reacts to certain things in the environment. We learn what kinds of food she eats. We learn all sorts of things before we're born. There's a huge amount of learning that takes place in the first 9 months of life before we actually come into the world and start breathing on our own. We learn intonation. We learn actually a lot about language in those first 9 months, but we particularly learn a lot about culture. So let's say that you're a Pitaha child. What are some of the things you see that are different from American children? Well, I remember one time that a woman who was about 9 months pregnant was going off to work in the fields. And they have to pull manioc out of the ground, which manioc can be this long, and it's this thick of a tuber. And they have to get a machete, and it's hard work to pull up one. But every woman brings back a full basket, which is probably 50 or 60 pounds of manioc. And I remember she went off, and as they do every morning, to go work in what fields that they have. And then in the afternoon, I had a little study out in the jungle, screened in, and I would work out there. And it was right on the path where everybody came and went to the jungle from the village. And I saw her walk by, and she had the manioc on the back, and I said, well, what's different? Oh, she's holding a baby. So she had the baby, got the manioc, and came back. This is a very different way of looking at birth. When somebody dies, what happens? If you're a small child among the Pitaha, you will see dead bodies growing up. You will see people die. And you will see the way they're treated and the way they're put into the ground. There's no buffering. There's no special agency that comes in to take the body so we don't have to see it. They just see people die, and they know they're going to die. And there's no fear about that. That's just, this happens. So these values start to get developed. Children are nursed until they're about 3 or 4, and sometimes 5. And while they're nursing, they share mama with maybe a sibling, or maybe a dog, or a wild boar. I mean, they nurse just about any mammal. When I asked the Pitaha, I asked a guy, I said, so what don't they nurse? And he said, piranhas. That's Pitaha humor. So you see this, and you share the breast with an animal, you're going to have a different view of life than without anything verbal ever spoken. Take my little grandchildren who visited me, or my children who grew up in the village. I've been there for a long, worked there for a long time. And watch them. What happens when you take a little American kid and let them run around a village? They fall down, they cry, they burn themselves, they cut themselves, they get stung by bees. Pitaha children already have skin like leather because they've never had any, any baby cream or anything. They've been sliding around on their bottoms all day in the dirt. They've been stung plenty of times. They're graceful. They don't make a lot of noise. I mean, they do with their playing. They do play. But if they know it's time to sit still, if you take off on a 10-day canoe trip with a 2-year-old, how many of you know a 2-year-old that's going to sit still the whole time? Pitaha children sit still because if they don't, they're in the water. Not because their parents threw them there, but because everybody fell in the water, because they put so much in each canoe. The tremendous amount we learn about culture without a single word ever being spoken. So the Pitaha have inspired this book and this view of language, but it's also informed by languages from around the world, quite a few different languages. So I'll talk a bit about some of these things, and then I'll see if there are questions from you, and quite happy. If you see something that's really pressing, you can ask, feel free to ask a question at any time. But the Pitaha, and I talk about them because they're not what this book is about, but they are the inspiration for this view of language because they have such an unusual language. They have a number of characteristics that are missing in other languages. No numbers. The only language known that has no numbers, not even the number 1. They have no words for color. They have no religion. They have no stories of the ancient past. They have no fiction. A number of interesting characteristics. You wouldn't notice these. It's amazing how much you don't notice these things when you're with them. So remember that I told you they have incredibly complex verb forms. We've done, along with some psycholinguists from MIT, experiments that show that their short-term memory, everything is, there's no difference that we can possibly, we've ever been able to identify in their intelligence. If anything, we're the ones who seem stupid out there. I walk with them in the jungle, and one of their favorite tricks is to see if I can take them back. You know, a lot of people think, gosh, you've lived in the jungle for 30 years, you must know everything about the jungle. I don't. I can't get lost in 10 minutes outside the village. And so we walk out maybe for a couple of hours out into the jungle, and they say, well, Dan, you could take us back. This is great entertainment for them, because they know I'm never going to take them back. And I take they don't make big trails. They basically, so, I could probably do better now than I could 30 years ago, but I really wouldn't want to, depend on, you see shows like Survivor, and you think, boy, I'd like to take them out with a Pitaha and leave them there for a while. A Pitaha man can walk into the jungle with nothing and come back 3 days later with a full stomach and a bag full of stuff and baskets woven and all sorts of things. So the Pitaha are found here. If you take out all the country boundaries of South America, it's right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. And it's where, in the Maisi River here on the side, is about 300 miles long. When you see a river in the Amazon, these are old windy rivers. And Einstein was the first person to, as far as we know, to give us a reasonable way of estimating the length of all these rivers. He said, an old river like this is just flying over them, right? It turns out to be correct. An old river like this is, the length of it is the distance in a straight line times pi. So I would have never thought of pi, but there it is. So if it's 100 miles in a straight line, it's about 314 miles long river. And we've lived all up and down. We first went there when my son was 9 months old. He just got tenured in anthropology at the University of Miami, and my daughters were 3. My middle daughter, Chris, is now was just promoted to the national manager of professional practice for minute clinics nationwide for CVS pharmacies. And my oldest daughter is still a missionary in Brazil. Her husband is a jungle pilot. Actually, my middle daughter's husband is also a pilot. He's in Indonesia right now training other pilots. This is the first book that I wrote, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, very popular in Germany. And so I'll just give you a little bit of what it was like to do field research and find out these languages. Most of the information that formed the basis of linguistic theories, in spite of studies of African languages and American Indian languages and others, came from Indo-European languages like the ones we speak. And part of the reason for that is it's so difficult to do field research. And back in the days that people like von Martius was off exploring, there was no linguistics. So he didn't have the training. He spoke several languages, and that was great training, but it wasn't the same as technical linguistics. So he was the first one, after a Catholic priest in the 1700s, he was the first one to visit the Pitaha. He was the first one to take any sample of their language. So he took some word lists in 1821, and they're extremely accurate. I mean, they're amazing. There's some characteristics of Pitaha that he would have had no training to look for, and yet he tries to represent them. You can tell that he heard them. The only mistake that he made in his entire list of words was, and it's very funny to recreate this story of something that happened in 1821, is the word that he has and translates as "come with us" actually means "stay here." So it's really funny to see that. The next person to visit the Pitaha was another German, the father of Brazilian anthropology, trained at the University of Leipzig in Germany. Kurt Unkel, also, but mainly known to Brazilians as Nemendaju. He took an indigenous name. He died in an indigenous village, and he, by horseback, canoe, and hiking, visited just about well over 150, as far as I can tell, indigenous groups of the Amazon. Some of those are many, many days hike one way. And he was a tremendous explorer and visited the Pitaha. He also took a word list, which was quite accurate, and I didn't notice any major differences except that he didn't write the tones. of the language. There were American missionaries there. After we'd been there for a couple of years, this is sort of what we looked like as a family. My kids still speak to me. I mean, they went for a period after I rejected Christianity where they didn't, but now they do. And they love this part of their background. They feel really good. So what do you do when you get to a place like this? You don't arrive in an area like this to build a theory of language. You arrive to cope and to try to figure out what they're saying. So the first thing is using the monolingual method of field research. What does monolingual mean? It means there's no language in common. So most linguists, when they do field research, can sit down with someone. Let's say you're trying to figure out how Navajo works. Well, your Navajo informant language teacher probably speaks English and probably speaks it very well. So you say in English to them, how do you say this in Navajo? And they tell you, so you can start learning. But in places like the Piraha, there is no language in common. They don't speak Portuguese. I don't speak Piraha. So how do I go about learning the language? We start by learning nouns. I got off the plane for the first time. A little Cessna aircraft set me down there, and I was surrounded by Pirahas. I was airsick. I hate Cessnas. And I got off and I picked up a little stick and I said stick. And some Piraha guy said "I," so I wrote down "I" probably means stick. I don't know if it means stick. It could mean shut up. It could mean that's your finger. It could, who knows what it means. But interestingly enough, it probably, and it turned out to mean stick. This is something about humans. We get what other humans are trying to figure out a lot of the time, even without a language in common, even when our cultures are very different. The next thing I did is drop the stick. And he said, "I migik kaube." So I figured, in the migik kaube business, there's probably ground and fall. So then I took the stick and I threw it. And it said, "I obihain." So that probably means throw. I don't know what it all means. I pointed to this and he said, "Migi." So migik kaube. I is stick, migi is ground, and kaube is fall. So there we are. And I did all sorts of things, like I sat down, and everybody laughed because I sat down on the ground. Then I stood up and I wrote down the words that they said for sit down and stand up. And from that you start to build sentences. In fact, this summer for the Linguistic Society of America at their Summer Institute, they've invited me to do a demonstration on how to do this. I mean, there's going to be an audience of a couple hundred linguists who never worked in this particular method, so I'm going to do this demonstration. And as I tell people afterward, the way it works is they bring in somebody who speaks a language that I don't know, and I switch to Piraha. I know they don't know that. And then we work together for about 25 minutes with different props, and at the end of that time, I start to explain the language as I understand it up to that point. And then I tell people, just do that every day, all day, for a few years, and you have it. There's nothing magic to it, it's just hard work. As I visited other villages, the plane was not always practical, thank goodness, because I hated it. So one of the ways we traveled was by boat. This is the boat. This is not usually the kind of boat I rented. Usually the kind of boat I had was a little outboard and I went a net. This was rented by the film crew when they made the movie for the Smithsonian Channel that has come out last year, that you can find if you search Grammar of Happiness Smithsonian Channel. This is the boat that the movie crew used. And so this is the Piraha's reaction. They would not normally be standing there when a boat comes up, but they knew I was on the boat because I stood at the prow of the boat and said, "It's just Dan, don't worry about it." So that is one of the ways they travel. Very interesting thing about Piraha culture. They depend on canoes because they live on the water, but they don't make them. They steal them. Or they trade for them. But they don't make this kind. I brought a Brazilian in to teach them how to make canoes. But after we did it, they said, "Yeah, we don't do that." They learned how to do it really well, but they said, "Buy us a canoe." And I said, "Well, here's the tools. You can go make one," which involves going out into the jungle, choosing an enormous tree, chopping the tree down, chopping the other end of the tree off, cutting it out. Then after a while, you have to, after you hollow it out, it doesn't come in that width. You have to take it and put it over fire and slowly stretch it and put in longer and longer sticks until you get it the length that you want. If you do it wrong, it splits in half. You wasted all that time. Once it's done, that tree didn't happen to be on the side of the river. It'll probably be a couple of miles from the river. So you try to find a place to float it, and if you can't float it, it weighs, you know, only a few hundred pounds, and you're gonna have to carry it out to the river. The one that they made, as soon as they got it out to the river, my daughter sunk it. But they got it up. They were able to get it up. Anyway, you see the little bit of freeboard they have here. How many people are in it? They actually do make a kind of canoe, but it's just they just take the bark off a tree and go around with that. You know, usually nothing at either end, just sitting in the bark. Every Pitaha. This is another cultural fact. If I take a Pitaha man out, he's going to wear a 38-centimeter waist and pants. He's going to weigh 110 pounds, and he's going to be about 5 feet tall, 5'2". Women will weigh a little more, often, but their weight is somewhat more variable. But it's fascinating because their genes are not homogeneous. There are a lot of groups that have intermarried with them over the years. So their size and their weight is a cultural fact. That's an interesting thing. The tallest people in the world today are the Dutch. But before World War II, they were of average height. And since World War II, they've become the tallest people in the world. How has that happened? Well, the genes were there all along, but culture changed, diet changed, lots of other things happened to enable the genes to flourish. The Pitaha, if they were in a different environment, would probably look much Shirley Jumper. And they live right on the beach. They don't have enough huts for everyone because most people sleep on the sand. They don't need places to store their possessions because they don't have many of those. And that's actually a value of theirs not to have many possessions. As the water rises, they move farther and farther back into the jungle, but they're always at the edge of the water. That voice that you heard is a man speaking in a falsetto. That's just a normal sort of Pitaha speech, but in a falsetto. And by doing that, he represents an entity the Pitaha call a fastmouth, that they believe to be non-fictional. And if I were to go talk to the guy, he would deny that he was the person I thought he was. He would say, that guy's not here, I'm a fastmouth. And the next day, if I said that there was a guy talking in a falsetto the night before, he would say, really, I wasn't here. So it's an important part of their culture. This is just a few scenes of who they are. But one of the things that makes you think about different linguistic possibilities is when you see people talking differently than you had anticipated, perhaps. Now, what I'm going to show you now are some what I call channels of discourse in Pitaha. Channels, different ways of talking. They're not unique to Pitaha, but to have so many in one language is highly unusual. So the first one is hum speech. Okay. So hum speech, she can say anything that she wants, anything that we can say with consonants and vowels, or they can say with consonants and vowels, they can do by humming. And this is very common. Each one of these channels has its own set of cultural functions. So this has the function of, it's the most common form of speech between caregivers and children. It is used by people when they don't want to be overheard. Interesting thing, Pitaha is not, they don't whisper. This is what they do instead of whispering. And I tried to figure out that one time, why don't they do whispering? And then I realized, oh, because it's a tone language. So, and I'll give you an example of that. Each of the vowels has to have a pitch, whether it's high or low. And if you get that wrong, you don't understand. So Chinese is like that, and Vietnamese is like that. Many languages around the world are like that. But if you speak a tone language, when you relax your vocal cords to produce whispering, you lose the ability to distinguish the tones. So it's not surprising that they don't whisper, but they hum. Another form of speech is whistle speech. So we're going to go to a scene where a fellow is making a bow and arrow, or an arrow, and he thinks he is being filmed to make the arrow, but he's trying to be really serious because he wants to show the camera how to make an arrow. And another guy off screen, I said, get him to whistle with him, and which means to speak high. So he starts whistling to him, and the guy tries to ignore him because he's being filmed, and then he says something funny, so the guy starts laughing. So they're talking about, we're going to go hunting, these people want to see us whistle, so let's whistle to each other. And again, they can say anything with whistling that we can say with consonants and vowels. It's not limited, it's not like our humming or anything like that. It's a completely productive form of the language. So other things that have attracted the attention, when I started talking about the facts of Piraha, a lot of linguists were skeptical, and so one of the results is that teams have come down from a number of eminent researchers have come from a number of well-known institutions. So when I made the claim that Piraha didn't have numbers, this has now been confirmed by 4 sets of independent experiments. The first one from Columbia University, from a friend of mine at Columbia. The second one by researchers from MIT, and then a researcher from Stanford. And then the last one, which I didn't even know was underway, was by my son. And he did a bunch of experiments, and he's published his results as well. So this has been confirmed a couple of times. It's difficult to see because the Piraha have words that seem to mean one, two, and many, which is a fairly common system around the world's languages. But how do you know that something means one? So you take a group of objects and you put one on the table and you ask the Piraha, what is that? I mean, what is the size of that? And they say, Hue. You put another one up and they say, what is the size of that? And they say, Hue. So those are 2 different words, by the way. So is 1 and is 2. So it's ton. Then you put 3 or 4 up there and they'll say Bagisu, which means a lot. That's what I thought. So 1 too many. But after a while you start to question this analysis. So I remember if they bring in 3 fish of equal size and you put 2 here and 1 there and you say how many is this or what is the size of this, they'll say what I thought meant 2, and this one they'll say 1. But bring in 2 small fish and 1 large fish and the number is reversed. So they're really not numbers, they're relative quantities. And it turns out that what I thought meant many means to pile on top of each other, to make a pile. So we started off with the experiments with the team from MIT, and we put 1 object on the table, and everybody said Hue. We put 2 objects on the table, everybody said Hue. And then we put 3, and there was always mixture between Hue and Bagisu. So maybe 2, what we thought meant 2 means a few, and then Bagisu is many, so it's sort of relative. So that would mean they have 1, a few, and many, let's say. And then the researcher from Stanford said, hey, let's count backwards. Let's see what they do if we put 10 objects up there and start to take them away. So we put 10 objects up there, and as you can see, some of the people said Bagi, so the majority, and some of them said Hue, or excuse me, Hue. And then, by the time we get to 6, however, most of them are saying Hue, whereas when we were adding the numbers, most of them were saying Bagis. And then when we get to 5 and 4, the numbers go up for the ones who are saying Hue, 1. So at 6, they're already starting to say what I thought meant 1. By the time we get to 3, 2, and 1, it's 100% of all subjects, about 20 subjects, that all say 1. So what does that mean? Well, it means that they're relative quantities. And so if you just have 1 up there, that's the smallest you can get. So you get the smallest relative quantity. And then you put another one, you get a larger quantity. But if you start taking away, you get to that smaller quantity. They don't know how many you're going to take away. So by the time you've taken away several, they'll say, oh, it's a really small quantity. Now you've taken away some. You keep taking it away, and then you get 100% agreement. So these really aren't numbers. Number is supposed to be innate to humans. But again, it doesn't seem that possessing numbers is something that all humans have. I mean, so some people say, well, this is just an exception, right? It doesn't mean that we're wrong to say everybody has numbers. It just means for some reason they don't. But that's like saying that all swans are white and we found a black one. But that doesn't mean all swans aren't white, it just means that's a black one. Actually, it means that it's wrong to say all swans are white, right? However few black swans there are, they're not all white. So there's actually an interesting philosophical discussion about when something's an exception and when it's a counterexample. This seems to be a counterexample. These are some of the things that got me thinking about language and the nature of language and what was innate and what was found in all languages. And this led me to a cultural principle here. So this little word here, idipio, means to go in or out of experience. It's a very important concept for the Piraha. You could say we have a phrase sort of like it, peekaboo, when you play peekaboo with children. But it can be used for sounds, it can be used visually. It's an exciting thing for the Piraha. When they see a canoe go around the bend of the river, which they see every single day, they say, wow, he just idipio left right there. And then they'll ask me things like, what happened to him? Well, I don't know, he's going fishing. So when something passes out of perception, there's a question about whether it really exists. They're sort of philosophers here in that sense, and although they really want data for things. So also if a match is flickering, they say it's idipioing. It's going in and out of experience. So this is a very important principle. The idea that I proposed a principle. So they notice there's no number words, there's no color words, there are no creation myths. They have no words for grandfather or grandchild or anything like that. They have, in fact, the simplest kinship system ever recorded. They have no oral histories. You know, we hear that people without written literature have oral literature, and the Piraha do have oral literature, but they're all contemporary events. They're not old stories. So many peoples in the Amazon have a value immediacy of experience. It's more important to think about things to do today than it is tomorrow or yesterday. In fact, it's a peculiarly strong American value that we worry a lot about the future. And we talk a lot about the past. We're all concerned about our genealogies and where we came from, and we want to know about these things. We're really concerned about lots of things that are going to happen after we're dead, which we're really not going to have a lot to do with. But we think about these things, and sometimes we worry about these things. The Piraha don't seem to worry about much. I mean, if they're hungry, they want to find something to eat, but there's a solution to that. Go fish. So most of the problems that they encounter on a daily basis, they can solve themselves, except for death, and people die. So there's no problem that they feel that they need to worry about. And their language reflects this. Every utterance that they speak has to have evidence, and it has to be short. And I'm giving a technical talk tomorrow at University of California, San Diego, and then at University of California, Irvine, about some of these more technical aspects of the speech. But the idea is that culture clearly limits what we talk about. How many of us get up in the morning and talk about Confucius? You might, but you've heard of it. How many of you get up in the morning and talk about the kinds of fish you're going to go get that day? Some guys do, but I don't. So what we talk about is culturally determined. It's in our personal experience. And imagine you're in a culture where things are much more homogeneous. We're a culture of strangers. I know a lot about you because we're in the same culture, but I don't know you and you don't know me. And every time we walk out of a building, we see people we don't know. It's impossible to get through the day without seeing strangers. In fact, most of the people we see are probably strangers, except when we're at home or at work. And for the Piraha, that almost never happens. Everybody they see is known to them, and known very well. They know their entire history. So this is a difference between two kinds of societies, societies of strangers and societies of intimates. Small tribal societies are societies of intimates. And this leads to a lot of implicit information. If I'm talking to you, there's a lot that I might need to tell you for you to understand where I'm coming from. But for the Piraha, there's a lot they don't need to say because everybody knows what they're doing. And when I write down their stories, at times I can't understand them. And it's not because I don't speak the language. There's just so much information left out. And I get them to fill it in, and oh, now it makes sense. I can see that, you know. There's a story about a guy who had gone hunting, and then the next line says the fire was coming out of my mouth. And I'm saying, what do you mean the fire was coming out of your mouth? And he said, oh, you know, that's how we say when we put a flashlight in our mouth so we can paddle and follow stuff. You know? So that's how they describe it. And these are cultural things. They're not just linguistic information that's left out. So the language, if there's an immediacy of experience principle, which means we talk only about the things, we only make assertions that can be verified by someone who is alive now or was alive at the time of telling, and that we either saw it or we overheard it or we deduced it, that limits what we can talk about. And I argue that that explains why there's no oral history. I remember asking them, who created the trees? This is back in my missionary days. What do you mean, who created the trees? Well, you know, there were no trees. Who made them? You have some evidence that, I mean, you saw that there were no trees? No, I mean, if people say there were no trees. Yeah, well, we don't say there were no trees. So they came in one day and they said, hey, Dan, so Jesus, is he brown like us or is he white like you? And I said, well, you know, some people say he was brown, some people say he was white, but you saw him, so what did he look like? And I said, well, you know, I didn't see him. Your dad saw him. What did your dad say about him? Well, my dad didn't see him. Who saw him? Well, I don't know anybody who saw him. He died long ago. So why are you telling us about it? It didn't make any sense at all. And talk about things for which there's no evidence. So oral history is not possible if you have to have a witness alive at the time of telling, or who saw it before they died. You have things that go beyond. So why don't you have words for grandparents? Well, most of the time, you know, you do see your grandparents at times, but most of the time you don't. And there's a nuclear family. The life expectancy when I first got there in the late 70s was probably about 45 years. It's gone up now with government intervention, but you don't tend to see your grandparents all that much because of the way the society is. Even though you know there are women and men who are grandparents at 26. Think about that. But if you're on a shorter life expectancy, that's not terribly surprising, especially since children can be relatively independent from the time they're 9 or 10 years of age. They know what they have to do as adults, and they don't need adults telling them what to do. In fact, it's another thing. If you're a child among the Peter Han, pretty much nobody tells you what to do. Life's hard enough. You got to make a living. You got to help mom and dad. When you're weaned, life changes. You go from getting everything given to you to now you got to work. So you go off with mom. You're 4 years old. You go off to pull up plants. She's not going to make you carry a 50-pound bag, but she might make you carry a 2-pound basket of manioc. She might make you bring back one piece of firewood. You're going to have to do something. All the kids work. What happens when a child falls down and hurts themselves? They get scolded. Dummy. But if they're really hurt, they get help. But by and large, you know, you see little kids. One of the films we made with the psychologist from Columbia University shows a little toddler about a year and a half playing with a butcher knife. And he's just swinging back and forth. And then he drops it, and his mother's talking to us, and she just reaches back and hands it back to him because it's his toy. Do they get cut with it? Yeah, all the time they cut themselves. But they learn pretty quickly what's hot, what's sharp. That's one reason they're so graceful by the time they're 4 years of age. They're tough little critters. Other cultural values, and all of these relate to the way things they talk about, the way they talk about them, and this affects the view of language. And as we look at many societies around the world, from New Guinea to Australia to even different parts of the United States, we find that the culture definitely affects not only what we talk about, but the way we talk about it, the very form of our speech. You know, so you know, and some of this is historical, but it comes from cultural roots. So in Pennsylvania and some parts of Kentucky, because I hear my wife speak, you say things like, for me in San Diego, I would never say, like, this car needs washed. I would never say that. But it's natural to a lot of people. It comes from Scotland. It's a Scottish expression. Or get out the house. You know, I would have to say get out of the house, but a lot of people say get out the house. Or I'm going down the pub. That's what you say in Manchester, where I taught for several years. I wouldn't say that in my dialect of California English. In fact, the first lecture I gave overseas was to the phonetics department at University College London about 31 years ago. And I remember I was talking, and really nobody was listening to what I was saying. They were listening to how I was saying it. So, excuse me, you actually say it like that? Yeah, I do actually. And so we take, actually, it's easy to get offended too if somebody questions the way we say things. These are grammatical principles, but the grammatical principles that come out of a particular kind of culture. And that's what the second half of the book is all about, where these examples come from. So what is it to be human? There's nothing that tells us more about being human than the way we communicate with one another, than this language that we have, that we share. And give you an example of one of the, and then I'm going to just go to a few other things and close. An example of one of the predictions it makes. What's the relationship between our genes and our culture? We actually know that there's a strong relationship between genes and culture. There's an entire branch of anthropology called neuroanthropology, about how the cultures we learn affect the development of our brain. That's one of the most amazing things about the human brain, is how plastic it is. So, but there are lots of other effects. So how many of you like cheese? I could ask the same question in Beijing and no hands would go up. Very few hands would go up. I could ask the same question in some parts of Africa. And in other parts of Africa, hands would go up. To like cheese, to like milk, cheese is actually a mitigated form, but to like milk after you're about 3 years of age is an unusual characteristic, and it's only existed in our species for about 7,500 years, between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. The ability to digest lactose, lactase persistence, it's enzyme lactase to digest lactose, that humans lose after they're weaned, except for those cultures that have developed cattle culture and milk culture. And then it turned out to be really good if you could still drink milk, because it's a great source of protein. So those cultures, by natural mutations and cultural pressures, developed the ability to drink and process milk. Tibetans who live in high altitudes have a genetic alteration that allows their blood to saturate with oxygen far more effectively than others. This genetic development is only about 3,000 years of age. How long have we spoken language? Tens of thousands of years. So if language were carried on the genes, it makes the bizarre prediction that not everybody should be able to learn everybody else's language. There ought to be natural genetic mutations favored by local cultures, as we see with all sorts of things, that would prevent somebody who speaks a language of type A from learning a language of type B. We never see anything like this. This prediction is never borne out. It's actually the strongest prediction that the theory that language is innate makes, but it's never borne out. If language, however, is the result of interaction with our culture and general intelligence, we predict that everyone can learn every language. Although, subject to the caveat, as the Pitahan tell me, in their words, our heads are hard when we get old, which is like us saying you can't teach an old dog new tricks, which I think is this is some more of their beautiful area. This is what it's like to do field work there. Most of my time has been spent like this, in a hammock with a tent to hold my supplies and a guitar to keep me sane, and Pitahan voices like this coming in through the door. I'll close with some photos that were taken for the New Yorker essay on the Pitahan by Martin Schiller, one of the world's leading photographers, and several of these hang in the National Portrait Gallery now. That guy's 70. And then just a few more amateur photos. This is making the documentary about them. Traveling the river. And this is the My Sea as the sun goes down. It's a beautiful place. You start to hear the alligators and the frogs and all sorts of things. And then thinking about the theory of language. Ultimately, the Pinaha took my belief and made it hard to maintain. So what's the empirical evidence for faith? It's not heaven, because no one's ever seen that tells us about it. It's not happiness, because the Pinaha, or a lot of people are happy without it. It's not fearlessness, because the Pinaha are fearless without it. It's not tolerance, because they're the most tolerant people I know of. And it's not death, because death is a natural component of human existence. So my own particular experience was to come to the conclusion that I didn't have enough evidence for the things that I profess to believe, and so I don't believe them. But thank you very much, and I'll take questions now if you have questions.
They're a very or a close group of people. How do they experience people outside? In other words, you know, they say, okay, we look like this, we have evidence, and how do they explain someone from the outside that has different values, different looks?
Well, I am the evidence. So I'm there, and you're like this. So interestingly enough, they don't expect me to eat what they eat. They say, do you know how to eat this? And so if it looks like something I don't want to eat, I say, I don't know how to eat that. Nobody's insulted because it's my problem. They find it, you know, some of us really, you know, interesting, and you know, there are all sorts of interesting situations where they ask you very intimate questions. Many women who come from the outside, American women, don't dress like Pinaha women, and maybe they wear pants and they have short hair. So, you know, little kids will be feeling them all over to see what gender they are. Shouldn't bother you either, but they come up with their theories about how these things work. So I'm the evidence that there are people that are different. And now they've also seen lots of Brazilians and people like this. They have no desire to be like them, but they also have no desire to condemn them. People are different.
Do the Pinaha get angry, and if so, how does it affect their speech?
They get angry, but not nearly as common as you might think. It's rare for Pinaha to get angry, although they do get angry. For an adult to get angry with an adult outside of drinking, which is an import from the outside, I've never seen that. I've never seen two men come to blows. I've never seen two men stand and yell at each other. I've never seen two women stand and yell at each other. I have seen children do that a lot, and nobody tells them not to. But I don't see adults do that. So these are, you know, big differences between them and us. Not to show anger.
Genetically, do you know where they came from? Did you try to figure out what their origins were? Anything like that at all?
We haven't done any genetic tests. When I started talking about, you know, fundamental differences in Pinaha that led to my thinking, people said, he's saying they're, you know, they're retarded. This is not what I'm saying at all, but some people thought I'm saying that they're cognitively deficient. So I don't do genetic tests. I've told many people if you want to do it. But it seems that they came from Peru during the time of the Inca. There were tens of thousands of people who spoke this language, as far as we can tell, from the 1700s. And since the river that they one time controlled goes into Peru, deeply into Peru, in Peru it's known as the Madre de Dios, and in Brazil is the Madeira, 7th largest river in the world. That's probably where they came from. In the back there?
You said they have very simple social structure. So do they have jealousy? How do they choose mates? Are they monogamous for life? Is there a mixture in the families? Do they get jealous?
Those are good questions.
Women and things like that?
They're largely serially monogamous like we are. So one person at a time, and some people may stay with the same person all their lives, some people may not. There's no stigma attached to that. Marriage ceremony doesn't exist. They start living together. And divorce doesn't exist. They stop living together. What happens, they have a time, usually during the full moon, where they like to sing and dance, but that's actually walking in a circle and using what I call musical speech, which is the same tones of their words provide the melody, but the rhythm changes. So it's a cross between singing and speaking. And that's a time to be promiscuous, and lots of people are promiscuous during that time. And if you come right back, I remember going to visit a guy one day to get him to work with me, and his head was in his wife's lap, and that's fairly common because they like to groom each other. That's a very common practice. And I said, you want to work today? And he started to raise his head, and I saw his wife had him by the hair of the head, and she banged him over the head with a stick. And he was grinning real big. He says, I can't go anywhere today. And I asked somebody, I said, why is he like that? Oh, he was messing around last night, so his wife's punishing him today. So these things happen. They're not, if two people go off for several days, that probably means they're going to become a couple. And then their spouses will look for them and get very upset, but when they come back, that's the end of it. There's no physical conflict or anything like that. Yeah.
Crime, wars, feuds.
Concepts are foreign to them. They did fight back in their history. We do know that they fought. But the current Piraha, who've been like they are for over 150 years, don't have fights or feuds or wars. It's difficult for them to understand that concept. I remember one night, late at night, there's not a lot of entertainment in the Amazon, so I had a DVD, I think it was The Patriot. You use what you have. And I waited till everybody had gone to bed, and I put the DVD in with my headphones on, and I'm sitting there in the pitch black of this hut watching it, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder, and a couple of Piraha guys want to watch it with me. So I take, he says, look like they're killing each other. I said, yeah. Then I have to explain that this is not real, this is fiction, right? So, doesn't look like fiction? Looks like they're really killing each other. You people kill each other? Well, sometimes. We don't do that. I remember telling the story when I was a Christian about the suicide of my stepmother, and it was a very emotional story, and I was trying to use that story to talk to them about how I was real like they are real. And I finally explained that she committed suicide. They all started laughing. And I said, well, what are you laughing? This is a serious story. You people kill yourselves? That is the weirdest thing we ever heard of. What on earth? So you also don't see Piraha sitting around brooding. You might see them sitting around sick. There's just a huge amount, I believe, that not just from the Piraha, but various indigenous societies that we have to learn from them about psychological well-being. Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to understand your theory. It sounds like the nature-nurture debate.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I'm also curious because I see that you're an educator. So all of those years sitting with children, did you ever try to teach them to count?
Yes.
And what
At their
happened?
request.
Okay.
They wanted to learn to count because they saw me using money with Brazilian traders. Because their way of dealing with traders, because they didn't speak any language in common, they spoke a trade language, a teeny bit of a trade language, just a few words. Anyway, they would bring like a basket full of Brazil nuts and throw it on the deck of the boat, and the guy would give them what he thought it was worth. And if another boat owner gave them a bigger pile of stuff for the same pile of Brazil nuts, then they liked that person. But when they saw me using money, I knew exactly what I was going to get. And that was strange. So I started math classes with my family. My kids were helping teaching. I made popcorn. People came over every night for about 8 months. We did that. 8 months nonstop in the jungle for about 2 hours a night. And the kids learned just like that to count. I mean, there was no problem at all. The adults didn't. But so then I had a 12-year-old guy come start teaching the class. And so he would ask some older guy, he would say, so what's this? Come on, stupid, what's this? And he needed some pedagogical training. So the next thing, the adults made him leave he had to go fishing somewhere, he had to go to another village.